What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. I hope you guys are going to enjoy this episode. It's absolutely beautiful in the garden today. We're going to be talking about intercropping and intercropping around tomatoes. This is a really common question we get asked, and that's because we had a video that I uploaded like 2 or 3 years ago go absolutely viral. And there's a lot of people finding that video and coming onto our newer videos or commenting on that video about questions they have with intercropping around their tomatoes. And so I thought it'd be a good opportunity, since I'm planting my tomatoes, to talk about this topic because it is a great way to grow more food in less space. And that's what this channel is all about, is getting you to grow more food in less space and have more fun gardening. And so there's a lot of benefits with intercropping. And one of those benefits is that you're going to be covering the soil. You're actually going to be keeping the soil cooler in the summer. You're going to be watering a lot less because there's less evaporation from the sun beating down on the soil and the wind blowing across the soil. There's going to be less weed pressure because there's more plants growing that you want to grow versus bare soil where weeds can grow. And so there's tons of benefits with intercropping, but unfortunately there's a lot of misconceptions around it. And so I want to kind of touch on some of those plants that are really good intercropping plants, and also talk about some plants that don't make the best intercropping candidates, because there was a lot of questions on that as well. Now, the first thing that I really want to touch on is the question of should you intercrop when you're growing indeterminates or determinants? And this really just has to do with how much space you have. You absolutely can intercrop with a determinant. You know, a determined tomato, or a determinate tomato has a determined height and a determined fruit yield. It's not as beneficial to intercrop around those plants because I'd much rather you just plant them as closely as possible, because they need 3 feet spacing just to even grow healthy. It's very difficult to intercrop around those plants. Yeah, you might be able to pop a basil plant in between a grouping of 4 plants, but that's not very effective when it comes to intercropping. Yes, it is intercropping, but it's just not as effective as indeterminate. When you're growing a plant and you're single stemming that plant up a stake, you're aggressively pruning all along the stem to basically focus all the energy on just one main growth stem. You're gonna have way more usable soil to plant other plants. And so I prefer to grow indeterminates for that reason, because it allows me to plant my stuff 1.5 feet apart versus 3 feet apart. And I'm also getting plants all around my tomatoes as well. So many, many benefits to growing indeterminate tomatoes and single stemming them. Now, the first plant that I want to talk about, which is not a good interplanting, is plants that compete with nutrients. If you have a plant like, for instance, like a very nutrient-hungry plant like cabbage or broccoli, very nitrogen-hogging plants with big green leaves, they're going to have a tough time growing next to a tomato, because a tomato is also a very nutrient-hogging plant. And so 2 nutrient-hogging plants don't make the best candidates for intercropping. Also, broccoli has huge leaves, big leaves, and they're going to be able to kind of grow into the tomatoes, and they often just get a little bit too big to intercrop, so big leaf things are kind of a no-go. Similarly, things like zucchini, huge, giant, dinner plate sized leaves, they block a lot of airflow. They end up kind of holding humidity and moisture near plants that causes things like powdery mildew and blight, but also it blocks a lot of sunlight, which kind of slows down growth, and it also steals a lot of nutrients because of how nutrient hogging the plants are. So big plants and leafy plants are not the best candidates. You want to think about stuff that is kind of like small, right? Beets. Beets make amazing intercropping candidates because of how fast they grow, how low they grow to the ground, and the fact they can benefit from a little shade. They're not really going to compete too much with a tomato plant. Also, think of things like lettuce, right? Plants that love that shade, especially when it's really hot out, they're going to benefit so much from that extra shade that the plants provide, that the tomato plants provide. And so planting lettuce next to your tomatoes is going to give you some much needed shade so you can grow your lettuce longer into the season. Also, things like carrots, right? Carrots are very great because they grow down rather than up. You're growing a root crop next to a tall plant like a tomato, you're going to have far less issues. Those roots are going to go down, whereas the tomato plant's going to grow up, and they're kind of growing in opposite directions. And so sometimes opposites attract, and that makes them a very good intercropping candidate because they love that shade. That shade actually helps keep them cool, and the extra moisture that the shade will provide is going to be beneficial for the good carrot development that you want. Carrots like damp soil because it actually helps them to grow deep down rather than get all wiry and fibrous when the soil gets dry. The next intercropping candidate that doesn't work the best around tomatoes are vining crops. Things like pole beans, cucumbers, any type of melon or pumpkins. Those vining crops, they're gonna vine and they're gonna end up using your plants as support. As much as you try to make it not happen, eventually there's gonna be one stray little tendril, it grabs your plant, and that's all it takes for them to kind of drag that plant down. And once your tomato plants are dragged down by weight, they're very prone to things like snapping. And also once the plants are heavy with fruit, that extra weight just tends to kind of drag them closer to the ground. And you wanna keep your tomato plants off the ground as much as possible because that's also going to reduce things like disease. So just extra weight and using your plant as support, it's not a great combo. And also those extra leaves, if you have like a pole bean using your tomato as support, that pole bean is gonna be growing up your tomato plant. If the weight's not a problem, the extra leaves will be a problem because later on in the season when it's hot and humid, those leaves need to dry. You need good airflow in between your tomato plants so that they don't have things like blight later on. And so because tomatoes are so prone to blight, you want as little excess foliage as possible. And that's why you prune your tomato plants. That's why I advocate pruning tomato plants so you don't have lots of restricted airflow. And vining plants have lots of leaves, and when they start using your plants as support, that's a problem because that's going to be way less airflow to dry out the leaves if they happen to get damp. So if you don't want disease, try to keep vining plants away from your tomatoes. All right, the final thing I wanted to touch on is the concept of companion planting. Now, companion planting is kind of a subcategory of intercropping, and it basically says that you are going to intercrop with plants that help each other, right? That's the idea of companion planting. They're good companions. And this is an issue for me because the fact of the matter is that plants do not communicate. They cannot communicate. Companion planting would say, plant carrots next to onions because the onions will help the carrots. They are not communicating. They are not saying, hey, I'll help you out if you help me out. They don't do that. The scent of the onions can help prevent things like carrot fly. They absolutely can. But it's inadvertent. They have no idea that they're planted next to each other. So really at its base, you have a lot of gardeners that read these blog posts or these articles and say, okay, tomatoes, what's a good companion plant for tomatoes? And they have the will to intercrop. They want to intercrop, but they exclude 90% of the other plants that would be perfectly fine to intercrop around their tomatoes because some blog post says, just stick your basil next to your tomatoes. Basil does not help tomatoes other than the essential oils given off from the leaves, and that can help deter things like aphids. That's it. That's it. You could plant things like marigolds next to your tomatoes. You could plant things like onions next to your tomatoes. You could plant lettuce, radishes. You could plant carrots. You could plant bush beans. There's so many things that those lists leave out because someone just wants to create a list that says, plant this next to this for this reason. And it's one singular reason, but people take it like it's the gospel truth, and they like I said, they omit 90% of the other plants that are great plants to grow just because they're so worried and getting bogged down about these specific companion plants. Yes, the companion plants is kind of a rough guide to give you something that will grow well together, but it's by no means the only plant that will grow well next to this plant, right? So that applies to anything in the garden. And we've filmed lots of videos on why I don't recommend following companion planting guides. And that's simply because there's so many different guides that there's intersecting opinions about what to plant next to what, and people often just say, okay, well, I'm just not gonna interplant because I don't wanna mess something up. And so when it comes down to it, just think of things like smart plantings and not so smart plantings. If the plant gets tall, don't plant things that are tall. If the plant needs airflow, don't plant things like vining plants that are gonna use it and use the plant as support and block the airflow. You plant things that are gonna be smart, that are gonna grow as a good understory crop, that are gonna benefit from the shade, that is gonna help to insulate the soil, to hold moisture near the soil, to help keep the soil more cool. And plant things that are gonna give nutrients back to the soil, like bush beans and plant things like that. Those are good beneficial plants. And as long as you stick to those rules, there's really no other rules. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you learned something new. As always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow big or go home. And as always, we'll catch you all later. See ya.